So reciprocity, what is it? How does it work? Let me show you an example. So we have our shutter speeds, we have our apertures. Let's say that you use your camera and you click on your light meter, right? And your light meter says, hey, if you want to get a good exposure, start at 1/15 of a second, and to get a good setting, let's say that it tells you your aperture needs to be at 8. I'll put it right in the center there, right? I'm just making this up, but let's say that that gives you a certain amount of exposure. So reciprocity essentially is when you acknowledge that and say you want to get the same exposure, but you change these settings. So let's say that I don't want to use 1/15 of a second because that puts me in tripod territory and will create a blur in my photos. So if I take 1/15 of a second and I bump it up to say 1, 2, 3, 1/25. Now I don't need to use a tripod. Well, I just changed my exposure. I just let in less light. So I need to compensate and add more light over here. So if I bump this down 1, 2, 3, I'm now at f2.8. This exposure of 125 at 2.8 and 1/15 of a second at f8 is the exact same exposure, but obviously it's going to give me different settings. My depth of field is going to get narrower, and my shutter speed is going to get faster, and I no longer need to use a tripod. Another example of this, let's say I wanted to actually freeze my subject, so I bump it up to 1/500th of a second, and I bump it down to 1.7. So you see how that works. So again, I go 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I have to bump this down and let in more light over here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm at 1.7. All these are the same exposure. There's reciprocity in a nutshell. So the question here is, what is then reciprocity failure? So reciprocity failure is something a little bit different, because what happens in reciprocity failure is essentially that's where your camera cannot compensate for you. So let me show you an example of that. Let's say that I decided I wanted to bump my shutter all the way up to 1/2000th of a second. I really want to freeze my subject. So I have to bump this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My camera cannot compensate. It can't go 2 more stops down. It would be somewhere down here. So reciprocity failure is essentially where you can no longer adapt and find a shutter speed and aperture that works for that setting. At least one of the, you want to keep one of the settings, but you can't adapt the other. That's reciprocity failure, and it does happen. It depends on the lighting situation you have. I just simply in this environment cannot take a picture at 1/2000th of a second, or even 1/1000th of a second, or 1/4000th. These settings are off limits to me. In this environment, I'd have to go to a brighter environment. That's reciprocity failure.